Jordan Ritter-Kahn writes narrative features about sports, culture, and national and international affairs. He has worked at Grantland and ESPN, the magazine. He's also written for New York Times, Sports Illustrated, and a number of other outlets. Jordan is a two-time finalist for the Livingston Award for the defender, Manute Bol's journey from Sudan to the NBA and back again, and for his story, A Death in Valdosta. His podcast, Sonic Boom, was named one of the top 50 podcasts of 2019 by The Atlantic and was nominated for a Webby Award. His piece, The End of the Hoop Dream, was named among the top 10 stories of 2015 by longform.org. Jordan has reported on the protest movement in Hong Kong, the refugee experience on the Turkey-Syria border, and the aftermath of civil war in the Ivory Coast, and the independence movement in what is now South Sudan. Here in the United States, he has written features about survivors of the Pulse nightclub shooting and about the police killings of Tamir Rice and Breonna Taylor. He is a graduate of the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism and Lee University. Jordan is also the 2021 Dayton Literary Peace Prize runner-up in nonfiction for The Road from Raqqa. Please welcome Jordan Ritter-Kahn.
There's a word that comes up several times in Andrea Elliott's remarkable, necessary, and gorgeous book, Invisible Child, a word that struck me every time I encountered it. The word is presence. Andrea describes the presence of mice and roaches in a Brooklyn homeless shelter. She describes the towering presence of a tough and loving public school teacher named Miss Holmes. When writing about one father who chooses daily to be there in his children's lives, and one father who does not, Andrea writes, quote, "Nothing beats being present." That line, "Nothing beats being present," came up for me over and over again when thinking about Andrea's work on this book. The book tells the story of Dasani, a young girl from Brooklyn, over the course of nearly a decade of her life. Dasani is passionate, tough, curious, and fiercely, fiercely loyal to the people she loves. She's poor. When we meet her, she's living with members of her family in a shelter. She's Black, navigating a country built on the exploitation of her ancestors, her family, and herself. Andrea writes, quote, "She sees out into a world that rarely sees her." Dasani is the daughter of a mother and a stepfather who love her deeply, but who struggle with addiction and poverty. She is the big sister of several siblings who she often mothers, sometimes missing out on the experience to be a child herself. With incredible diligence and care, Andrea follows Dasani and her family as they travel along the margins of American society. She chronicles their moments of pain, of grief, of hunger, alongside their triumphs and their moments of joy. She draws her reporting from access to government records, from notes by teachers and therapists, from Facebook messages sent between Dasani and her sister, from Dasani's diary, and from many, many hours spent with Dasani and her family in homes and in homeless shelters, in classrooms, in trains and buses, on the streets of several New York boroughs, and the offices of government officials. What emerges is a portrait of a family that grasps for each other when so many forces pull them apart. A portrait of a girl cast aside by so many whose job it is to support her, but upheld by her own determination and by the love of people she encounters. Teachers in Brooklyn and Pennsylvania, a street performer and fitness guru named Giant, and in critical moments, Andrea herself. Invisible Child is a staggering feat of reporting and an elegant and moving piece of writing. But as much as anything, it is a remarkable example of the single most important thing a journalist can do: to show up, to be curious about the lives of those around us and the systems that shape us all, to be present. It is my tremendous honor to introduce, as the 2022 runner-up for the Dayton Literary Peace Prize in Nonfiction, Andrea Elliott.
Thank you. It's an incredible honor to be with you all tonight and to be sharing this stage with such remarkable and astonishing talent. Clint, your book will stay with me for the rest of my days. I'm humbled, if not a little nervous, to be the first of this year's authors to speak tonight. When I expressed this to one of your organizers, she said, "Oh, this crowd is so excited to have you all here that you could just get up and read the phone book, and it would be fine." I should also add that in an attempt at being helpful, one of your previous winners recommended that I might avoid talking about peace because, and I quote, "the subject has by now been exhausted." Well, I'm not going to read the phone book, and I am going to talk about peace because I've never been good at taking direction. When I think about the word peace, my mind travels back in time to my first weeks with Dasani Coates, the homeless child at the center of my book. What I noticed in those first weeks was that she never said goodbye at the end of a phone call or a visit. She was only 11 years old, but her childhood had been marked by more loss, more sorrow, more departures than many adults see in a lifetime. So rather than say goodbye, she opted for the word that her parents had taught her to say, which was peace. It was not just a word, but an acronym in the religious teachings they followed that stood for properly educating all children everywhere. Peace, they would say, also by way of greeting, and I learned to say it back, peace, until that word became the bookends of every encounter I had with them. Peace when we saw each other, and peace when we parted, even if the things I had witnessed in the time in between were the opposite of peace, from small moments to major events that made plain how deep racism runs in America. To say the word peace after losing your children to a system that polices Black and brown families and routinely separates them without due process. To write the word peace at the end of a complaint you have filed in the Brooklyn homeless shelter where staff members have just tossed your mother's urn into the garbage, never to be found again. To end the phone call with peace from Rikers Island jail, as Dasani's brother did with me just a few days ago, from a place that can only be described as a humanitarian disaster, where detainees routinely go without food or medical care. This year alone, 18 inmates have died in New York City's jails. At Rikers, Dasani's brother recently spent weeks in solitary confinement after corrections officers broke his ribs. Peace, he said gently on the phone. I think of Dasani's family's devotion to this word as the ultimate example of peace as action. We tend to think of peace as a pause to action, a destination, an ideal state of being, rather than as something that is still forming, something that is alive and molten and worthy of pursuit, even as it eludes us. So tonight, I want to thank Dasani and her family for teaching me that. I want to thank them for daring to trust in me and for giving me the precious gift of their time. I want them to know that to follow their lives has forever changed mine. And I want you all to know that the story of Dasani Coates is America's story. It is my greatest hope that Invisible Child will open people's eyes to how poverty and structural racism play out on the ground, and that to see into the life of this one brave child, from her deepest burdens to her greatest hopes, is to see our nation in all its dimensions. I'll close with the word Dasani taught me to say, peace.
Looks like it's going to be one of those nights. It's beautiful. Susan Southard's first book, Nagasaki, Life After Nuclear War, is the recipient of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize and the J. Anthony Lucas Book Prize, sponsored by the Columbia School of Journalism and Harvard University's Nieman Foundation for Journalism. Nagasaki was also named a Best Book of the Year by the Washington Post, The Economist, Kirkus Reviews, and the American Library Association. Nagasaki has also been published in England, Spain, Denmark, China, Taiwan, and Japan, and excerpts of the book have appeared in journals around the world. Susan's work has also appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Los Angeles Times, and Politico, among others. She holds an MFA in creative writing from Antioch University, Los Angeles, and was a nonfiction fellow at the Norman Mailer Center in Provincetown, Massachusetts. Susan has spoken before the United Nations and continues to speak at international disarmament conferences, universities, and public forums around the United States and abroad. She teaches graduate-level nonfiction seminars and directed a 3-year creative writing program at a federal prison for women outside Phoenix. Susan was the founder and artistic director of the Phoenix-based Essential Theater, serving marginalized communities across the Southwest for 32 years. Susan is the 2016 Dayton Literary Peace Prize winner in nonfiction for Nagasaki, Life After Nuclear War. Please welcome Susan Southard.
Thank you, Gilbert. And good evening, everyone. It's such a great pleasure and honor to be with you tonight. So, it is my very great honor to introduce to you Clint Smith, author of How the Word is Passed, a book in which Clint takes us to 7 sites that have deep and profound roots in and very different ways of remembering the institution of slavery in the United States. With Clint, we go to Southern slave plantations and cemeteries, one for 30,000 Confederate soldiers and one for 2,200 enslaved children killed over a period of 40 years in the early to mid-1800s. We go to Angola Prison, which was built on the property of a former slave plantation and today has a population that is 75% Black. To Manhattan for a walking tour of both slave trading and the Underground Railroad there. To Galveston Island, where on June 19, 1865, Union General Gordon Granger announced to the people of Texas that all slaves are free. And to Gorée Island, off the coast of Senegal, where African men, women, and children were forced onto slave ships to begin their journey through the Middle Passage. All of these places are critical to U.S. history, but it's Clint's weaving of past and present that is visionary, because we can see, smell, taste, and feel each place, both now through his personal experiences and reflections during his visits, his interviews with staff and tour guides, and his informal conversations with visitors to see how they give meaning to these sites. And in the past, through haunting narratives about the enslaved adults and children who lived in these places. How the Word is Passed allows us to see the historical and contemporary realities of the political, legal, economic, educational, and psychological impacts of white supremacy upon which our country was founded and built. It allows us to feel some of the countless terrifying realities of forced labor, family separation, medical experimentation, rape, torture, and murder, all birthed and nourished by white supremacy. This book allows us to better understand the myths, lies, minimizations, justifications, and silencing that allowed white supremacy to flourish both during the centuries of slavery and in the 157 years since slavery was abolished in our Constitution. How the word is passed invites us to continue to interrogate what we've been taught, to hold the horrific truths of our history, and to confront again and again the complex question of accountability. My life is already transformed by this book. On the drive here with my father through North Carolina, Virginia, West Virginia, and Ohio, I could no longer take for granted the superficial views of the land and people all around. How did and how does slavery and continuing white supremacy play out in all of our lives, in every square mile of this nation? Clint ends his book with an intimate essay about his grandparents and his great and great-great-grandparents that illuminates with insight and love how close the history of slavery and its aftermath is to those of us alive today. In one of my favorite passages, after listening to his grandparents recall some of their early experiences of segregation and violence, Clint writes, "While I knew vaguely about how the smoke of slavery and Jim Crow had billowed over their lives, I did not know the specific shapes of their silhouettes. I did not know how either of them had walked through this burning country without turning into ash." Please join me in welcoming to the stage our 2022 Dayton Literary Peace Prize winner in nonfiction, Clint Smith.
How's everyone doing? Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you for this remarkable award. I want to thank my editor, Vanessa Mobley, whose vision helped bring this project to fruition. I want to thank my agent, who's here, Aliyah Habib, who is a relentless advocate of my work. I want to thank my kids. Those of you who were here last night know that I'm known less as Dad and more as Brachiosaurus #1. I love you more than the moon, the stars, and the sky. I want to thank my wife Ariel, who couldn't be here because we have 2 little Brachiosauruses at home. Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Nick, and the judges and this entire Literary Peace Prize community for this remarkable honor. I've been sitting here this evening watching the slideshow, which is both remarkable and incredibly intimidating to be in the presence of writers, both here with me tonight, and to think about the lineage of writers and artists and truth tellers and storytellers who have been a part of this community, this brilliant, remarkable, special community you all have built. I've been thinking a lot about some different people from the book over the course of the last 2 days. I've been thinking a lot about Norris Henderson from Angola. For those of you who are unfamiliar, Angola is the largest maximum security prison in the country. It's 18,000 acres wide, bigger than the island of Manhattan. It's a place where 75% of the people held there are black men. Over 70% of them are serving life sentences. And it was built on top of a former plantation. And what I tell people all the time, and alluded to last night, is that if you were to go to Germany, and you had the largest maximum security prison in Germany, and it was built on top of a former concentration camp, in which the people held there were disproportionately Jewish, that place would quite rightfully be a global emblem of anti-Semitism. It would be abhorrent. It would be disgusting. We would never allow a place like that to exist because it would so clearly run counter to all of our moral and ethical sensibilities. And here in the United States, we have the largest maximum security prison in the country, where the vast majority of the people are black men serving life sentences, many of whom were sentenced as children. The United States is the only country in the world that sentences children to life without the possibility of parole, many of whom were sentenced by non-unanimous juries, which has since been rendered unconstitutional by the Supreme Court of the United States for being a vestige of white supremacy. And I think about what are the specific contours of anti-blackness in this country that allow a prison to exist on top of a former on top of a former plantation in a way that we would never allow in a different sort of geopolitical context. And I've been thinking specifically about Norris Henderson, who I spent time with on my visit there. And Norris was incarcerated in Angola for 30 years. And when we were leaving the exit of our tour together, of our time together in Angola, we saw these men who were working in the fields in the distance. These men who were lifting their garden hose into the air and digging them into the earth, lifting their shovels into the air and digging them into the earth. And they were being watched by a man on horseback with a gun laid across his lap. And Norris looked at the men, and he looked at me, and he looked at his hands. His hands had these calluses on them from all these years he spent working in the fields of Angola. And he was like, "Clint, I can't explain to you what it felt like to pick cotton for 7 cents an hour, but while somebody was watching me on horseback with a gun over their shoulder and wondering if my ancestors picked cotton in these same fields 200 years ago." So for the people who are incarcerated in Angola, this history is not an abstraction. It's not a metaphor. It's not an intellectual exercise. It's in their bodies. It's in their bones. It's in the calluses in their hands. And I've been thinking a lot about the sort of profound unfreedom that exists in our prisons, the profound unfreedom, the profound lack of peace that exists in the lives of people who are incarcerated, that exists in the lives of children who are told that for something they did when they were a child, that they might have to spend the rest of their lives in a cage. I've been thinking, too, a lot about my grandparents, as Susan alluded to. My grandfather born in 1930, Jim Crow, Mississippi. My grandmother born in 1939, Jim Crow, Florida. And I remember walking through the National Museum of African American History and Culture with them. I'm pushing my grandfather in his wheelchair. My grandmother is walking a few paces ahead of us. And I'm walking through this museum, and I have this moment where I recognize that so much of the history of violence that is documented in this museum are things that my grandparents experienced firsthand. And when I ask my grandmother about it later, she has this refrain where she says, "I lived it, I lived it, I lived it." I think about how this project began with a desire to understand the way that the physical proximity, the physical landscape of slavery is sort of etched into this country in millions of different places, how the scars of slavery exist all around us. And in doing so, I think what happened is that I got a more intimate sense of our collective temporal proximity to this history, how this history that we tell ourselves was a long time ago simply wasn't that long ago at all. I think all the time about Ruth Bonner, the woman who opened the National Museum of African American History and Culture in 2016 alongside the Obama family. She sort of rang the bell to signal the opening of this museum that had been generations in the work. And Ruth Bonner was the daughter of an enslaved person, not the granddaughter, not the great-granddaughter. The woman who opened the National Museum of African American History and Culture in 2016 was the daughter of someone born into slavery. My grandfather's grandfather was enslaved. So when my 5-year-old son sits on my grandfather's lap, I imagine my grandfather sitting on his grandfather's lap. And I'm reminded again that this history we tell ourselves was a long time ago, just wasn't that long ago at all. I was on a trip to England a couple years ago, and I went to Oxford University and was on this tour of this prestigious historical university. And the tour guide was showing us all these different buildings, and he said, this famous poet wrote this poem in this building. This famous philosopher wrote this treatise in this building. This famous scientist did this experiment in this building. And he looked at one building, and he looked at the building and looked at us, and looked at the building and looked at us. And he was like, this building was built around 1020. And in my head, I'm like, AM or PM? Like 10, I couldn't even conceive of the idea that a building that had been built a millennium ago was still standing, was still functioning, was still something that people walked in and out of. But I bring that up because it's a reminder to me that the U.S. history is so young. It is so recent compared to the rest of the world. We're basically the annoying preteen of the world in more ways than one these days. But for me, it's a reminder that there are people who are alive today who knew, who loved, who were raised by people who were born into chattel slavery. They're still here, and they're still with us. So the idea that we would ever suggest that this history has nothing to do with the contemporary landscape of inequality. The idea that we would ever suggest that this history has nothing to do with our social, political, and economic infrastructure today is revealed to be profoundly morally and intellectually disingenuous. I've been thinking, too, about my ancestors more broadly. I've been thinking about how the first enslaved people came to the British colonies that would become this country in 1619. Slavery didn't end formally until 1865. But what's true is that from the moment enslaved people arrived on these shores, they were fighting for freedom. They were fighting for liberation. They were fighting for emancipation. And what that also means is that the vast majority of people who fought for freedom never got a chance to experience it for themselves. But they fought for it anyway because they knew that someday someone would. And I think about how my life, how my children's lives are only possible because of generations of people who fought for something they knew they might never see, but they fought for it anyway because they knew that someday someone would. And I think about what sort of responsibility does that bestow upon me? What sort of responsibility does that bestow upon all of us to recognize that we might not experience the fruits of our own labor, to recognize that we might be trying to build a more peaceful world, a more just world, a more equitable world, and to also have the humility and the historical recognition to understand that we might not see the manifestations of that work in our own lifetime. And for me, obviously this weekend we've been thinking a lot about peace. For me, that gives me a sense of peace, to think about the sort of peace that so many people were fighting for, that they never saw, but they fought for that peace anyway because they knew that one day I would. And for me, this moment, this award, this community, I think part of what I've come to understand about the people here is that it's a group of people who have dedicated their lives to remembering, to understanding, to learning, to unlearning. And what I know about this book and the way that this book has changed my life is that I've come to understand that without remembrance, there can be no peace. And that part of what we have to do is remember and to hold those memories and to sit with those memories and to wrestle with those memories even when they run counter to all of the stories we might have been told before, even when they're uncomfortable to sit with, even when they challenge the stories we've been told by the people who love us and who we love. And for me, that is the peace that I'm working toward, that every day I wake up and try to get a little bit closer to the version of myself that my ancestors showed me that I could be, and to recognize that, again, that my life and our lives, my children's lives, our children's lives, are only possible because of people who fought for something they knew they might never see. And so I accept this award with an enormous sense of gratitude, and may we all continue to fight for the world that we might not see ourselves.
It's definitely turning into one of those nights. Lisa Page is co-editor of We Wear the Mask, 15 True Stories of Passing in America, Beacon Press. Her work has appeared in The Atlantic, LitHub Weekly, The Crisis, one of my favorite magazines, Virginia Quarterly Review, American Short Fiction, Playboy, Washington Post Book World, and other publications. She is assistant professor of English at the George Washington University and director of creative writing. She previously served as interim director of Africana Studies. She is also a resident faculty member of the Yale Writers Workshop. She lives in Tacoma Park, Maryland. Presenting the 2022 Dayton Literary Peace Prize runner-up in fiction, please welcome Lisa Page.
Thank you so much, Gilbert. Writer Paul Laurence Dunbar wrote these words: "A crust of bread and a corner to sleep in, a minute to smile and an hour to weep in, a pint of joy to a peck of trouble, and never a laugh, but the moans come double, and that is life. A crust and a corner that makes love precious, with a smile to warm and tears to refresh us, and joy seems sweeter when cares come after, and a moan is the finest foils for laughter. And that is life." Writer Joanne Tompkins writes about life in her debut novel, What Comes After. I'm talking about life as it is for so many people who struggle with unspeakable loss, annihilation, violence, and pain. Life is grief. Life is suffering. Life is abandonment and disappointment. This novel, so aptly titled What Comes After, is about what we do when the worst thing you can possibly imagine happens. It is also a brave interrogation of the nature of evil and of evil's sweet side, the evil that makes doing wrong feel so right, the evil that can cajole and coerce and seduce and corrupt, the evil that presents itself as pleasure and agency. What Comes After is also a roadmap to evil's opposite, a highway to that better place of reconciliation and forgiveness, resilience and faith, that complicated place where everything isn't perfect, but relief is real, and so is safety. Tompkins' characters lose their way, and they also find direction. They find that crust of bread, that corner to sleep in, that pint of joy. This too is life. Joanne Tompkins' first career was as a trial lawyer. Mediation immersed her in lives disrupted by conflict, injury, violence, and abuse. Her work explores the small moments that hold the possibility of transformation. Her short work has appeared in journals such as High Country News, Lit Hub, Writer in the World, Stratus, Journal of Arts and Writing. What Comes After was a Washington State Book Award finalist, a Best First Novel by an American Author, a finalist for the Edgar Award, and a runner-up for the Dayton Literary Peace Prize for fiction. Please welcome Joanne Tompkins.
Oh my goodness, it is such an incredible honor, and I am so humbled beyond words to be here with all of you and these brilliant writers. And it is a scary thing to have to come up here after these brilliant speakers. Oh my Lord. So just let me tell you that I'm going to speak from my heart and as clearly as I can. I'm so grateful to everyone in the Dayton Literary Peace Prize for being here and doing this work and for making this one of the most amazing weekends of my life. And as a debut novelist, I really must thank my amazing agent, Susan Gollum, who took me on when I had such little to show for myself. And the entire team at Riverhead Books, and in particular, my remarkable editor, Sarah McGrath. I turned to writing late in my life. My legal career before then involved many cases of great trauma, but one case in particular stayed with me. 19 years ago, 2 high school football players in Seattle brutally murdered another football player. They had spent much of the summer planning the murder, all the while pretending to be the victim's best friend, sleeping over at his house, calling his mother Mom. Before the murder, the victim's mother thought of these 3 young men as her children. When they were convicted of first-degree aggravated murder, she hugged their parents and she expressed her own intense sorrow at the loss of all 3 of her children. She still loved these young men. There is unspeakable suffering in this world, and thankfully, astounding grace. In what comes after, I wanted to examine how we as individuals in our daily lives and with our own personal traumas, how we move from great loss and betrayal into a reconnection with life and love and community, how we move toward grace. When I look at the world today, I suspect our troubles boil down to one thing. We are profoundly confused about reality. In an epigraph that opens what comes after, Thomas Burton succinctly encapsulates what I believe is our primary confusion. We are already one, but we imagine that we are not. And it is this false belief that we are not already one, that we aren't part of each other, that what happens to one of us doesn't happen to all of us. That is what causes all the problems. Which is why tonight I want to briefly discuss the insights of trauma-fedorians and Quakers. In Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, Billy Pilgrim believes he is placed in a zoo on the planet Tralfamadore. A guide at the zoo explains to fellow trauma-fedorians that being human is like being bolted to a flat car on rails over which you have no control. While your head is encased in a steel sphere, there's only one tiny eye hole to which is affixed a 6-foot-long pipe. Humans, the guide explains, believe that tiny dot of vision at their end of their particular pipe is all there is to see. I suspect that everyone here tonight is driven by a desire to expand their own and others' vision. We are working diligently to create more openings in those steel spheres and to loosen the bolts that affix us to our rails. We are trying to create more angles of views. In doing this, we do the important work of increasing our understanding of each other. And I believe, as importantly, we begin to understand how little we actually know, how profoundly wrong the most treasured of our beliefs can be. Hopefully, we gain a much-needed humility and a profound curiosity. We might even begin to treat those who see the world from a different angle, not as a threat to our very identity, but as a guide to parts of this vast life that we have no way of knowing without them. Ultimately, though, the facts may not save us, as we are finding out. And this is where Quakers have some guidance. Isaac, the protagonist, and what comes after is a Quaker. And I should mention, since there are different types of Quakers, that he is an unprogrammed Quaker, one who participates in what are largely silent meetings. I am not Quaker, but I have been lucky enough to spend a lot of time with them over the years. And they have taught me that words are often a distraction from the truth, and that they can easily foment conflict rather than create peace. But we don't need to despair, because we can meet at a place of understanding that exists inside each of us. And it is an inner landscape more connected and expansive than anything we were ever going to see through that tiny little pipe of ours. It is a felt place where we don't need to agree on the facts, to love one another. Quakers believe that if we move out of our minds and into our hearts, if we go still and work at quietly seeing each other, we will meet each other. And all these surface differences that have created such suffering and violence in this world will disappear. We will wonder why we have been fighting ourselves. While this Quaker concept is far deeper and more profound than any understanding I ever managed on my own, it did match up perfectly with what I discovered in my many years of mediating high trauma cases, with sitting with pedophiles, and with the parents whose children had been abused and tortured, even murdered, with quadriplegic 16-year-olds and the drunk drivers who injured them, with employees who had been grossly discriminated against and employers who felt not only innocent but often virtuous. Peace between the parties was rarely reached through forming a consensus on the external objective facts. When I was mediating, when I started mediating, I thought I would settle cases with my persuasive skills. But I quickly learned that the outcome would invariably come down not to my words, but to my state of being, how I was holding each individual before me at the level of my heart. Whenever I found myself wondering, why is that person being so difficult? Why are they being such a jerk? It was, if I stopped and I made myself look inward, the problem, the flaw, was not in them, but in my state of being. I was processing them not as a human, but as a problem to be overcome to achieve my objective, which was a settlement. No wonder they were resisting me. Yet when I managed, and believe me, I often did not, but when I did manage to open my heart fully to them, which means to love them, to appreciate them in some deep, quiet way, the shift in them was often immediate and startling. There would be this tremendous softening. We know when we are seen. We know when we have met someone at the level of our hearts. I opened this talk with the mother of the murdered football player. After I mediated a case involving that murder, I spent some time getting to know her. I thought it would be like getting to know a saint. But it turns out that she was, in fact, a very normal person. While she often found her way to grace, she often did not. But that never stopped her from trying again. She did this for the simple reason that she felt better when she freed her heart from the pain of bitterness. She taught me that no matter what horrors or traumas or losses the universe throws at us, there is one way in which life is endlessly generous. It always gives us one more moment to reach with love toward whatever and whoever is before us in this moment. And if we fail in this moment, we have the next moment, and we have the next until we die. This is what I hope readers take away from what comes after, that peace starts in our own hearts. It starts with our willingness to face our ignorance and our constrictions of love, not in judgment or blame, but as a doorway to a new way of being. Peace starts by forgiving others and ourselves past failings and thanking life for giving us yet one more chance to try again. One more chance to remember that we know each other at the level of our deepest hearts. We are already one. Thank you.
Just getting to know these authors a little bit, is it any surprise to anyone that their work is so profound? Alexander Starrett's first novel, The Beast, a loving satire of Britain's tabloid newspapers, was published in 2017. The Spectator named it as the book of the year, calling it irresistible, while the Sunday Times said, quote, "He proves that he is not only a very funny writer, but possesses the ruthless unsentimentality of the finest satirists." His second novel, We Germans, a story of German soldiers in the Second World War, was published in 2020. The New York Times said, Starrett's daring work challenges us to lay bare our histories, to seek answers from the past, and to be open to perspectives starkly different from our own. While Kirkus Reviews calls it a small masterpiece. We Germans has been translated into several languages. Starrett has also translated works by Franz Kafka, Stefan Zweig, Arthur Schnitzler, and others into English. In particular, he made a selection and translation of Kafka's best short stories titled The Unhappiness of Being a Single Man. Starrett was born in the northeast of Scotland. He has lived in Italy, where he worked for the Santa Maddalena Literary Foundation, and in Germany. He now lives in London with his family. Alex is the 2021 Dayton Literary Peace Prize winner in fiction for We Germans. Please welcome Alexander Starrett.
Good evening, everybody, and congratulations to Honorée Fanone Jeffers for winning this year's Fiction Prize for her novel, The Love Songs of W.B. Du Bois. In some ways, I felt a little nervous about what I was going to say about this book because it's, I am a foreigner here, ultimately, even though I do speak some American. And Honoré's novel, to me, reads as a new origin story for America. For those who haven't read it already, it begins in the 18th century with the first big elements in the melting pot. Indigenous Creek people, a young black man whose mother was brought from Africa in chains, and a young Scotsman come to the New World to seek his fortune. Unfortunately for me, the Scotsman turns out to be a villain, but we move on. These three bloodlines are fused in the body of a child. The first character we meet, a boy, has a Creek mother, a Scottish father, and an African grandfather. The novel tells the story of this boy's relatives, both black and white, through to the present day, and to a young black girl called Ailey Garfield. It toggles back and forth between Ailey's experiences and those of the generations that came before her. In that, it reads the phenomena of Ailey's life today in terms of her family inheritance. Her father's a physician, someone whose family moved north for education and professional opportunity. Her mother's an intelligent, educated woman who got pregnant at college and spends too much time looking after her husband and her daughters. Ailey has one sister at Yale. She has another sister who's addicted to crack. She has a grandmother who looks down on Ailey's mother because the grandmother has more money and can pass for white. At one stage, Ailey is sleeping with a black classmate who treats her differently from his white other woman. With the white girl, it's respectability and an attempt to be accepted by her parents. With Ailey, it's TV and red-hot casual sex. Out of innumerably closely observed characters and moments like these, Honorée succeeds in stitching together a tapestry rich and broad enough to encompass a subject as large as the black experience in the American South. There is so much in it. There's a lot of joy in it. There's devotion to church, violence, the chain gang, home training, the Black Panthers, the Southern comfort food that goes through the generations and sends Ailey's father to an early grave. Sex in particular stands out. In Honoré's novel, the politics of sex are where that inheritance is at its rawest and most revealing. We see people fall in love with the wrong people, whether people of the same sex, people from a different ethnicity. We see the bitter legacy for black Americans descended from white slave owners who raped their slaves. We see the resulting children who are considered not legally legitimate, children who are sent away, whose fathers don't recognize them. We also see how even the most racist white clan down in rural Georgia, a family of sheriffs and lynchers, is related to Ailey's family. In this view of America, the victims and the perpetrators are all bound together by blood. And we've heard other origin stories before, the Pilgrims, the Boston Tea Party, all of that. But I think we can see now that those are stories of America as essentially a white people's country that has black people living in it. And what I think Honoré has done is tell an origin story for the multiracial democracy that America has become since then. So please welcome Honoré Fanon-Jeffers, winner of this year's Prize for Fiction.
Good evening. Good evening. That's what you do when you black. First, as always, I give unashamed glory and praise to my mighty good God and to my indigenous and Africana ancestors for carrying me through. I'd like to thank my living mother, Dr. Trellie Lee James Jeffers, for giving me culture. I'd like to thank my oldest sister, the late Valjean Jeffers, for teaching me how to read and opening up a world that I couldn't imagine would give me such joy. I'd like to thank my mother's brothers and sisters for giving me storytelling. I'd like to thank my literary agent, Sarah Burns, and my former editor, Aaron Wicks, for their encouragement and their seeing my vision. So as I sometimes say to my students when I'm informing them that their papers are not yet graded, I'm gonna keep it real with y'all. Some of y'all are old enough to remember when the comedian Flip Wilson used to say, "What you see is what you get." So no matter where I am, I always try to be myself. And so this evening, my spoken remarks will hopefully reflect that. I will speak a word tonight, and that word is speaking your peace. When I was a young girl of 14, I was always afraid. I know now that it was because I was black in a female body, that the world was not a comfortable place for someone like me. It wasn't meant to be comfortable, and that was the point. But everywhere I turned, in real life or in the books that I read, there was a black woman looking out for me. And around this time, I started hearing a phrase that black women would say. They would say, "I'm gonna speak my piece." And it would confuse me because whenever they would begin to speak their piece, they would get angry and passionate, and they would rise and rise and rise on that emotion. But then finally, they would calm down, and everything seemed to be all right. And I remember when my mother, who before she was Dr. Jeffers, when she had separated from my father and she had gone to graduate school, she would talk about many of the things that had happened to her, how she had lost an eye at the age of 4 to a butcher knife and spent 2 years out of school, but when she returned and she kept on with school, she graduated as the valedictorian of her class. And she would talk about some of the racism that she had experienced in Eatonton, Georgia, growing up. But she would always repeat something that her daddy, Papa Charlie, had told to her. Things ain't always gonna be this way. And that's how my mama would speak her piece. And I remember when I went to graduate school at University of Alabama in the Masters of Fine Arts program, and there were only 2 black people there, and both of us were women. And we were given a very, very hard time. There was a lot of racism and a lot of questioning about our subject matter. For me in particular, my poems, because I had gone to a historically black college, which was considered to be beneath contempt, while the fiction writer had attended Yale. And in the building where I took my classes, there was an older black woman, and I can't remember her name. I wish I had written it down. And she worked as a custodian. And some days when I would get really upset, I would follow her around while she cleaned the building. And I would be complaining, and she would be listening, and she would nod her head. But one day when I was complaining, she stopped her work, and she turned to me and she told me, "Baby, I don't care how mean these white folks is. You go ahead and you get your degree because you don't ever want to work this hard. I worked so hard, baby, and every day I be so tired." I was stunned not only by her words, but by the fact that I'd only seen myself, my hardships, my fears of misstepping in the privileged white world I'd so eagerly courted. I heard the frustration in her voice, and I thought she had spoken her piece. And then there was the great poet Lucille Clifton, who is now gone, but who still visits my dreams. And it was another day of complaint when I was a poet of some success. But I had entered white academia, and I was being given a hard time on my journey to tenure. And she had come out to Oklahoma to give a reading, and I was so upset, and I flung myself at her feet before she went on stage to give her reading. And I said, "Miss Lucille, white people are trying to destroy black women today." I was very dramatic back then. And she told me, she said, "Ani, white people have been trying to destroy black women since we stepped off the slave ship. So you better get yourself together." And then later on stage, she stopped in the middle of this glorious reading, and she shocked me when she said, "What you need to understand is I'm not here to make white people comfortable." Miss Lucille had spoken her piece. And so when my book was accepted for publication, my first novel, my sixth book, and my first novel, and I was very afraid because for so long during my 2 decades as an author, I had tap danced and I had lied to white people to try to make them accept me and feel comfortable with the uncomfortable truths that I was telling. And many times when I would finish these readings, I would go back to my room and I would be so afraid and so ashamed because I thought, what was the point in telling about black history, about white supremacy, about what had happened to my ancestors if all I was doing was sucking up to white people? And so then there came that moment where I was in media training, and we were going through what it was that I was going to say, and we kept moving around, you know, what I felt the book was about, but I was very, very afraid. And so we had our little canned speech that I was supposed to give. And then it was about 5 minutes before I was due to appear on CBS This Morning when I prayed to my God. As the song says, God of our weary years, God of our silent tears. And I didn't want to keep saying things just to be successful, just to make white people comfortable. I wanted to tell the truth, and that truth was I had written my book for African American women. all those women who had shored me up, the living ones and those gone to glory, even before I was born, even before I was thought of. These women had prayed for me. They had prayed a place for me, and I needed to speak on them. And so I did. I opened up my mouth and I told the truth. And now I am here on this stage for and because of Black women who spoke their piece no matter the consequences. What extraordinary beings. I am honored to call my sisters and my kindred. Though I will continue to live in this memory-filled place that we call America, I will continue to speak my piece, and I will hope for the best. Thank y'all so much, and God bless you.
Clarence Page, 1989 Pulitzer Prize winner for commentary, is a columnist syndicated nationally by Tribune Media Services and a member of the Chicago Tribune's editorial board. Page is also a regular contributor of essays to the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer and has been a regular on the McLaughlin Group, NBC's The Chris Matthews Show, ABC's Nightline, and BET's Lead Story news panel programs. Born in Dayton, Ohio, Clarence grew up in Middletown. He began his journalism career as a freelance writer and photographer for the Middletown Journal and Cincinnati Enquirer at the age of 17. He graduated from Ohio University with a Bachelor's of Science in Journalism in 1969. He also has received honorary degrees from Columbia College in Chicago, Lake Forest College, the Chicago Theological Seminary, and the John Marshall School of Law, among others. Page was a reporter and assistant city editor for the Chicago Tribune, during which he participated in a 1972 task force series on voter fraud, which won a Pulitzer Prize. Page's other awards include a 1980 Illinois UPI Awards for community service for the investigative series titled The Black Tax, and the Edward Scott Beck Award for overseas reporting in 1976, Lifetime Achievement Awards from the National Society of Newspaper Columnists, Chicago Headline Club, and the National Association of Black Journalists. In 1992, he was inducted into the Chicago Journalism Hall of Fame. His book, Showing My Color, Impolite Essays on Race and Identity, was published in 1996 by HarperCollins. Presenting the 2022 Dayton Literary Peace Prize, Ambassador Richard C. Holbrook Distinguished Achievement Award, please welcome Clarence Page.
Appreciate it. I was sitting over there saying, boy, that sounds like a terrific introduction. Who's he talking about? You know, I said, oh my God, it's me. Thank you. Good evening. You learned your lesson. Well, congratulations. Now I know I'm home. What was it Sandberg who said, home is where you go and they got to take you in? That's how I feel like. It's been a long time. But indeed, I was born up the road here at the county hospital, and I was then driven on down to Middletown and finished my public schooling, and I went to William Howard Taft grade school, and we got Robert Taft here tonight. I want to tell you, I feel like my daddy used to say, my family's from Alabama, my daddy used to say, y'all walking in tall cotton now. So I indeed am doubly honored to be here with you, and I thank you, especially happy to be called upon to help honor my dear friend Will Haygood. a fantastic journalist, and I must confess, without embarrassment, one of my role models, even though I'm older than he is, I believe. Doesn't matter, he did such a good job of it. For more than 3 decades, Will Haygood's journalism and authorship have brought us a long march of engaging and inspiring real-life characters engaged in various quests for peace and answers to the always timely question, but what I call the King question. Not Dr. King, Rodney King. Can we all get along? A big question. In pursuit of answers to that question, Haygood has traveled the world writing about war, peace, and political activism for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, the Boston Globe, and the Washington Post. Born and raised in Columbus, Ohio, and graduated at Miami University. Welcome home, Will. He has written 9 books, covered war zones in Nigeria and India, covered apartheid in South Africa, was taken hostage by Somali rebels. You know you haven't lived to have been taken hostage by Somali rebels, I want to tell you. I mean, what's a war and correspondency for? And witnessed the release of Nelson Mandela. Mandela! He has covered riots in Los Angeles, interviewed soul singer James Brown in prison, and spent more than a month in Louisiana covering Hurricane Katrina. Everywhere he has shown a skillful ability to bridge racial divides and other divides, to foster greater understanding among diverse people and bring us closer to a peaceful and just society. Among his many other works, he's widely known for his 2008 article, "A Butler Well Served by This Election," a Washington Post piece about Eugene Allen, who served 8 presidents at the White House as White House butler. It became a very successful book titled The Butler, A Witness to History, and an award-winning film starring Forrest Whitaker and Oprah Winfrey, Tall Cotton. 3 years ago, another of his books, the 2018 Tigerland, 1968 to 1969, A City Divided, A Nation Torn Apart, and a Magical Season of Healing, taking us back to Columbus. It was runner-up for the 2019 Dayton Literary Peace Prize for nonfiction. It followed black high school athletes as they captured 2 state titles in Columbus, Ohio, in the turbulent late 1960s. Like Tigerland and The Butler, his 9 books share an underlying theme: Americans in pursuit of peace, fairness, and racial justice. He shares this theme in his various profiles of unusual, groundbreaking Americans, like Adam Clayton Powell, back in 1993 when that was published. Adam Clayton Powell, for you youngsters out here, helped to pass Lyndon Johnson's landmark anti-poverty legislation, including the Upward Bound program that I worked in at Ohio University and that Will's familiar with. Sammy Davis Jr., a major financial backer of Martin Luther King and on Selma, a behind-the-scenes figure in that score, but as important to the civil rights movement as Booker T. Washington was to W.E.B. Du Bois' civil rights movement. You don't hear about that all the time because people who are the quiet contributors you may not hear about, but their impact can be even greater than you imagined. Sugar Ray Robinson, who worked to secure financial rights for fighters, and the historic, contentious 1967 battle for the confirmation of Thurgood Marshall, first black justice on the U.S. Supreme Court. That book, Showdown, also was a Literary Peace Prize finalist. I'm glad you finally made it, Will. It's not being finalist all the time, you know. But his own family, in 1997, The Haygoods of Columbus, a family memoir. It's a wonderful idea. I'd like to do it myself. If I could ever write a family memoir and be able to face my family again. That takes courage. His most recent book, Colorization, takes a century-long look at decades of Hollywood's handling of the dreams of black actors, actresses, writers, and directors. Like Haygood himself, each subject used his particular talents to bring us closer to justice and peace, and he's been widely recognized for his social contributions. At his alma mater, Miami, a street on campus has been named Will Haygood Lane. It happens to be near where the Freedom Summer volunteers gathered before they headed south to Mississippi. I know them well, by the way, Will. One family stayed with us at our house in Middletown. That was my first brush with history, as it were. But that was what the civil rights movement was composed of in its heyday. It was ordinary folks stepping forward and saying, "We shall overcome." And indeed, I don't know if I ever bumped into James Chaney, Andrew Kudman, and Michael Schwerner, but I do know I heard in the headlines a few days later, after they left Middletown, after they left Oxford, after they left Ohio, when they disappeared. They were found, as we all know now, murdered by Klansmen in the night while they were in Mississippi trying to register black folks to vote. Watch those voting rights. I thought I would make it. In 2019, Will became the writer in residence of the Roger Brown Residency in Social Justice, Writing, and Sport at the University of Dayton. 3 years ago, Tigerland came along and was runner-up for the Literary Peace Prize. And as I say, he shares his themes in profiles in unusual, groundbreaking American stories. Like Haygood himself, each story used his particular talents to bring him closer to justice and peace, bring us closer to justice and peace. And we, in 2019, as Will himself said, race is the colossal story of our times. We overlook race at our own peril. I think people are growing more and more interested and intrigued with how writers can pull back the curtains, be it in Rwanda, or Liberia, or Bosnia, or America, to show the reality of life on the ground. Through his writings and lectures at the intersection of politics, history, and race, across racial, cultural, and various media, as a way to open our eyes to the need of reflection, dialogue, and change, he brings enlightenment to us all. And so, it is my honor to present the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, the 2022 Ambassador Richard C. Holbrook Distinguished Achievement Award, to a journalist, best-selling author, cultural historian, peacemaker, brilliant storyteller, and a heck of a nice guy, for his lifelong quest for justice and relentless struggle for peace, Will Haygood.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Clarence, for those warm-hearted, soulful words that you used to bring me to the stage. I want to thank you also on behalf of all of the writers here for the session at the Victoria Theater yesterday that you moderated and Gilbert moderated. From what I heard, many people across the community enjoyed that very much. I know you've had a long career at the Chicago Tribune. I would like you to know that before my journalism career caught a foothold, I applied for a job at the Tribune and no one ever wrote me back. I don't know, the application might still be floating around the newsroom for all I know, is somewhere out there. Let me salute the winners and the finalists and the nominees of this year's books. You chose your own path. You didn't want to write the 80th book on that man who was in the White House from 2016 to 2020. You chose your own path. You looked at a hill and you conquered it. Your reviews made a lot of noise. As we say on the streets, you blew the roof off the sucker. You all should be very, very, very proud of the work that you have produced. I myself stand here because of the astonishing legacy of Ambassador Richard C. Holbrooke. He went to lands that were dripping in blood. He crawled into tents at midnight to talk to warring factions, the Tutus and the Hutus, the Tutsis and the Hutus. He went to Liberia, he went to Bosnia. He went into places after leaders had been assassinated. Because the world, seemingly since the Civil War, has never been at peace. I have been able to travel some of the same landscapes that Mr. Holbrooke traveled. I'd go into these dangerous war zones and I'd wonder how much my newspaper loved me. But a foreign correspondent does not have the luxury to back out of an assignment. You simply must go. So I thank the Holbrooke Committee for bestowing this honor upon me. Sharon Rabb, you are a force of nature. I was at the Whole Foods when I got a phone call from her telling me about this award. I told her I was busy and that I'd be home in about an hour and to call me then, which she did. What a moment. No man or woman is an island. We writers write in quiet rooms and we're often alone. The past 3 years have made it seem lonelier than that. My first big city newspaper job was at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. My best friend on that paper and I used to walk down to Murray Avenue in Squirrel Hill, waiting on the union drivers to screech around the corner and drop the next morning's newspapers off. Me and my best friend dreamed about books and about literature. We would grab a copy of the paper and we would read aloud our lyrical leads, our lyrical first or two paragraphs. At least to us, they were lyrical. We would read them aloud to each other. In the moonlight on Murray Avenue in Pittsburgh. That best friend of mine, he went on himself to become an author. He works for CBS News in Pittsburgh. His name is Andrew Sheehan, and he has come here to be with me today, and I would like him and his wife to stand up. Andrew and Abby. You all are familiar with the horrific Tulsa race massacre from 1921. I met a lady in Boston years ago. She became amongst the first filmmakers to make a documentary film about the Tulsa massacre. I have stayed in touch with her through the years. She also is an author and an actress. She has come here to be with me today. Carmen Fields, a filmmaker. There is a lady who has been traveling around Texas as a lawyer with the fire and the ferociousness that Thurgood Marshall had to bring justice to those who need it. She invited me to Texas when my book Showdown was published, and I went there to talk to a large group of attorneys about the necessary way to remember Thurgood Marshall. She has come here today to be with me from Texas, Karen Burgess. I went to Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, right down the road. It was the only college that I applied to, and I don't know why. I didn't have a lot of money to be applying to 5 or 6 colleges because it cost like $15 to apply. I started hearing that other people in Columbus had gotten their letters of acceptance to Miami, and I didn't get mine. And I started getting nervous. And I came home one day, and I pulled out a piece of paper and a pen, and I wrote to the Dean of Admissions at Miami, and I said, "Dear sir, I have applied to Miami University, and perhaps I am on your bubble because I haven't gotten a letter that tells me I'm going to be refused admission or that I am going to be admitted. But I want to come to Miami University so bad that I make this promise to you. If I am admitted to Miami, I will someday do something to make you proud. I have no idea if that letter played a role in me being admitted to Miami, but 2 weeks later, my letter of admission arrived. Gregory Crawford is the president of Miami University. He and his wife, Renata Crawford, have come here to be with me today. I would like them to stand up. I'm a visiting writer at my alma mater, which is quite something because I graduated with like a 2.2, which is summa cum lucky. Sometimes I run into former professors of mine and they say, Will, if I would have known how your life was going to turn out, I'm sure I would have given you much better grades. But I tell them, don't feel sorry for my college transcripts because I rode that 2.2 to glory. I mean, I rode across the campus like I was on the back of a stallion. I mean, hey, I got a C. That means I didn't get a D or F. I'm not at the abyss. I'm still here. Christopher Makaroff is the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences and a very dear friend. He and his wife, Patricia, are here. I would like them to stand up. I was summoned to Dayton a day early. There's a gentleman at Sinclair College who wanted me to moderate the movie Till, about 14-year-old Emmett Till, who, as we know, was murdered in Mississippi. This gentleman took me into his office, and he had all of my books, even the book about the trip down the Mississippi River, which you can't even get on eBay. He's here, my man, Michael Carter. Sherry and Ray Paparaki are two journalist friends from Columbus, and they are here. Where are they at? Can you stand up? Okay, there you are, right there. And a dear high school buddy of mine, he's a military veteran. Happy Veterans Day. He has come here to be with me, Jack Winchester. I once spent 5 years on writing a biography of the entertainer Sammy Davis Jr. I was looking for his father and mother's obituaries. I found the father's obit easy enough. I couldn't find the mother's obit Sammy had passed away by the time I started doing the book. I called a friend of mine in New York. He put me in touch with somebody else, and they said, Will, the reason you can't find the obituary of Sammy Davis Jr.'s mother is very simple. She's still alive. And they said she's 93 years old and she's quite spry. So I got the phone number and I immediately called her and told her that I'm working on this book about Sammy Davis Jr., that I would love to come up to New York City and talk to her about her son, Sammy. She invited me to New York City. I sat in her apartment for about 5 hours. It was a wonderful session, and I said, Mrs. Davis, I'd like to come back, and I'd even love to take you out to dinner. And she said, well, then that'd be great, but I really don't want to go out to dinner. Let's go out. And I said, oh, okay, like where? She said, well, let's go dancing. So I said, is there anything that you'd like to see on Broadway? And she said, oh, yes, I'm interested in seeing that play, Ragtime. So 2 weeks later, I was back in New York, went to pick Mrs. Davis up, and we drive to the theater in a taxi, and on the way, she says, hey, I hope you didn't tell anybody that I'm Sammy Davis's mother, because I don't like name dropping. I said, no, Mrs. Davis, I haven't told anybody anything. I mean, I got the 2 tickets, which bid into my book advance deeply. Anyway, we get to the theater, we watch the play, and we're leaving out. She says she's enjoyed it so much that she wants to meet the star of the play, who was Brian Stokes Mitchell. We get outside, she wants me to take her to the stage door, and I say, oh, Mrs. Davis, look at that. That line is 200 deep. We'll never get in to see Brian Stokes Mitchell. She had a walking stick. She raised it up and she said, I'm the mother of Sammy Davis Jr. Get out the way. Please get out of the way. She had the cane up, and then when she brought it down, she poked the man in the rear end. And the man turned around and looked at me, and hey. 10 minutes later, I'm downstairs of the theater, face to face with Brian Stokes Mitchell. And Mrs. Davis introduced me and said, this is Roy. And then the great Brian Stokes Mitchell said, hello, Roy. The only reason I mention that is because, like Sammy Davis Jr.'s mother, I'm not into name dropping. But I know my friends Oprah and Forrest Whitaker would just love to see this audience and salute all of these writers who are here tonight. So I just wanted to tell you that. The people who I have written about, Adam Clayton Powell, Sugar Ray Robinson, Thurgood Marshall, Eugene Allen, the 5 starting basketball players on the East High basketball team, and the 9 baseball players, the history of blacks in cinema. These have been ferocious characters who I've tried to stitch into the American flag. That is all I've tried to do. Sometimes people ask me, is it hard to write about these characters who have lived through segregation and Jim Crow? And if it gets me down. And I think the thing that keeps me going is that the people who I have written about have all also had a ferocious wit. A ferocious wit. Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., he was a minister, and before he got to the New York City Council or to the U.S. Congress, he would travel to churches all around the country. When he was 30 years old, he was in North Carolina. He was at a train station. He was a black man, but as you can see in the picture on the wall, he was very light of skin. To the untrained eye, he might look white. Somebody at this train station told the conductor, hey, I think I saw a black man walking into the first class compartment. It was in 1930. He wasn't supposed to be in the first class compartment. The person went and got a train official. Adam Clayton Powell was comfortably seated in the first class compartment. The train official and a police officer dash into the first class compartment and say, hey, we think there might be a black man in here someplace. Has anybody seen him? Adam Clayton Powell Jr. pops up out of his seat, turns to the police officer and said, you better find him. What the hell kind of train you running around here? Get him out of here. That kind of wit keeps you going. When you come across a story like that, it puts a smile in your heart. He defeated the meanness that was out there. To wrap up, in 1991, I was in South Africa. Nelson Mandela was still in prison. There were places I could not go because of the color of my skin. I couldn't help but think about American history. Apartheid in South Africa. I met a guy named Jovial. He was a reporter. He was black. He had spent months in jail when he was 12 years old during the Soweto uprisings. Me and Jovial started hanging out. Every time you would go out on a story, large tanks would come to wherever the teenagers happened to have been marching. It was a tough assignment. Jovial, thankfully, knew all of these roads that were off the beaten path. One day, Jovial told me that he couldn't see me the following day. He said he had to take his mother to the hospital. He said he had to catch 3 jitney buses to a township hospital that was 114 miles away. I said, Jovial, I have a rental car. Take my car to take your mother to the hospital. He refused to take the car. I ran down to the hallway and said, Jovial, take your mother to the hospital. Take the rental car. He took it. He kept it overnight, and he called me the next day and said he was coming back to the hotel and that his mother had been admitted, but she was going to be okay. It seemed a simple gesture for me. It's simple. About 3 nights later, there's a banging on my hotel room door. I don't know if I'm about to be kicked out of the country for a story that I wrote that appeared in my newspaper, and one that the censors in South Africa didn't like. Just to be safe, I put 2 chairs up against the door because I wasn't going to let anybody in. It was late at night. I asked who it was. First there was silence. Then all of a sudden a small voice said, Will, it's Jovial. So I opened the door and I said, hey man, how you doing? How's your mother? And he said, in his South African accent, he said, hey good, you must get dressed right away. I said, why? He said, just get dressed right away. So I got dressed. We went down and got in my car, and we went to Soweto. Anybody could be arrested and stopped at any time. We took the back roads. I said, Jovial, where are we going? He said, just wait. He parks the car, and we walk through some woods. Then we walk up to a hill. When we get to the top of the hill, it's like a football field area, and it's candles. It's school children. And Jovial said, every week, Will, once a week, the children of Soweto meet in this field as their protest, and they sing, we love you, Nelson Mandela. We love you, Nelson Mandela. He said it's their defiance against the tanks that they know that they will see in the morning. So as the world turns, that's who we must be. The children with the candles in the valley. They brought Nelson Mandela home. Let us bring those home under the banner of peace who need to be brought home. God bless you and thank you.
I just want to say, like I mentioned earlier, I've been coming here for 10 years. I've had the absolute privilege to sit on the stage and watch some of people I consider heroes of mine speak. Brian Stevenson, Min Jin Lee, Andrew Solomon, Louise Erdrich, and now Will Haygood. And they've all been unbelievable speeches, but I have to say, in this particular evening, never been here when all four of the winners just absolutely knocked it out of the park and reached deep into their soul for those speeches. Incredible. And I will add, the presenters, former winners, did the same thing. And it was really a privilege to sit in this table and watch this tonight. Thank you all. That really concludes our evening. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. We're going to, ladies and gentlemen, it's a privilege to welcome to this event for the first time the Dayton Literary Peace Prize Chorus under the direction of the one and only Mr. William Henry Caldwell.
My solemn vow to take